back to The Storied Life. I'm your host, Bob Osborne, and this is session 9. As we near the end of this series, I want us to consider story endings. What does it mean for a story to end well? You might remember the TV series Lost that came out some 10, 15 years ago. My girls were saying at the time, "Dad, you've got to watch this," and so I did. Maybe some of you did too. It was quite the ride. Lost was this crazy, convoluted, twisting story with new storylines constantly brought in, new mysteries, new questions constantly emerging. And we who were watching assumed that each of these new pieces were clues to the ultimate meaning of the story, that all would eventually be resolved in the end. And looking back, that's really the normal expectation for anyone invested in a story. To care about a story means that you want everything to pull together, for all of the pieces to be explained, for all of the chaos to finally come to some kind of proper rest. And this is what we hope for in story. Maybe you've already guessed where I'm going with the Lost example, because for me anyway, everything just kind of fizzled out. The TV series Lost just kind of lost its way. Too many loose threads were left dangling, unresolved, unanswered. What began with a bang ended with a whimper. And it kind of made the whole experience unsatisfying. Which brings us to today's session. What are we looking for when we look for a good ending? And I mean this about the various pieces and loose threads of your own storied life. Think about all that has happened to you as a person, all that has happened to your family, your community, and your world. What kind of good ending do we need? What kind of good ending will satisfy us? Well, maybe the biggest challenge to the storied life is that of despair, this sense that life has no real meaning and that things won't or can't resolve in any satisfying way. Remember Shakespeare's Macbeth? Life, he said, is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Or to put Macbeth's words differently, if life is a story, it will ultimately fizzle out like the TV series Lost. Now, that would be kind of funny if it weren't such a serious point. So I'm warning you now that what you're about to hear for these next few minutes is quite despairing. It will be the tougher part of our series, but it doesn't end that way, so rest assured. When the pandemic shutdown took place in March of 2020, I thought it finally time to take this novel off the shelf and read it. The Plague by Albert Camus. What better time than 2020 to read this one? Camus' story is about a small Algerian city where a plague strikes, and at first, no one is sure what is happening, not the extent of it, not the seriousness of it, until the main character, Dr. Rio, suddenly realizes what he is dealing with. Camus writes this extraordinary passage about how we moderns tend to think. Everyone knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world, yet somehow we find it hard to believe in ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. Sure, says Camus, we know about plagues from history books. We know about all kinds of difficult things in the world, but these things happen to other people, people in other times, people in other places. Not here, not now, not us. Because we modern people have our plans. We have life already mapped out. So how can something as absurd and ancient as a plague crash our plans? But according to Camus, the absurd does happen. So he writes this: Our townsfolk were not more to blame than others. They just forgot to be modest. That was all. And thought that everything still was possible for them, which presupposed that pestilences were impossible. They went on doing business, arranged for journeys, and formed views. How should they have given a thought to anything like plague, which rules out any future, cancels journeys, silences the exchange of views? They fancied themselves free, and no one will ever be free so long as there are pestilences. Now, there's so much to unpack here, but let me just say, we don't talk much about our mortality, do we? It's sort of there, but it's unreal to us, like the plague, and so we tend to avoid the subject, like I avoided this book for all those years, until 2020 made it real. To Camus' credit, he thought death was the biggest thing there was to talk about. And it wasn't that Camus was a man of faith, quite the opposite. He represented a view called absurdism, this idea that we live in a universe that is both chaotic and without ultimate purpose or meaning. Camus thought that we should just accept death as the end of our momentary existence. Death is the end of our storied lives. And there is this 1984 novel by Milan Kandera, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It's set in what was formerly called Czechoslovakia in the time before and after the Russian invasion of that country in 1968. And it explores life within this pervasive atheism of that time. And what Kandera does in the novel is simply muse on whether or not human life has any intrinsic meaning. Do our daily actions really matter? Is love just some kind of illusion? So he does this by setting up a contrast between what he calls the weighty and the light. The weighty being the meaningful things, the enduring things, the things that matter. And light things being the frivolous, the things we can forget, that don't matter, the things that pass into nothingness. And Kandera's own view is that everything is ultimately weightless, light, and that nothing finally matters. But this is where Kandera gets real honest. This, he says, feels unbearable. And so the title of the book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And what he does is he explores this theme through the lens of human sexuality. And the characters in the novel form relationships, and they search continually for sexual liaisons, but all against this backdrop of a passing light existence. But again, all this feels unbearable. And why? Because the characters in the novel find love, and because, as all human beings do, they live for more than the experience of the moment. All of this happens to us, and we can't help it. And as I said before in this series, it's impossible to be meaningless, because meaning just seems to be inherent in everything. Even Macbeth's statement of despair, which I quoted earlier, is written not as gobbledygook, but as beautiful prose. So meaning, the way of life seems to be filled with significance, making it weighty and not light. And we all experience this. Kandera admits this, but he won't have it, because meaningful life makes demands on us. If each passing moment actually does have significance, says Kandera, then we are nailed to eternity as Jesus Christ was nailed to the cross. It is a terrifying prospect. The weight of unbearable responsibility lies heavy on every move we make. And so he asks his readers, what then shall we choose? Weight or lightness? Kandera is on the horns of a dilemma here. He doesn't want life to carry intrinsic meaning, but he admits that it feels like it does. And if it does, then the best image he can think of is of Jesus himself. Jesus nailed to the cross. That's the best symbol of weighty, meaningful significance Kandera can think of, for all kinds of reasons. Jesus on the cross is the most consequential thing that ever happened. Well, let's consider the central moment in the storied life of Jesus. It begins in a garden where they arrested him late on the Thursday night. He would often visit this garden in his last week to pray, to be with God. Gardens remind us of our original human placement, I think. Remember the beginning of the big story of Scripture? Gardens speak of the world as a place of blessing. But all of that had been lost, as we know. Our first parents had turned away from the author of life, and the absurdity of death had now crashed in upon the human condition. And Camus and Kandera tell us this is just the way things are. I think Jesus believed something else. This is not the way it's supposed to be. Earlier that evening, Jesus had rehearsed the great story of Israel with his friends. At supper, he had celebrated the traditional Passover Seder, which told the long story of Israel. But that story, while it had a glorious past, hadn't yet fully resolved. Not fully, not yet. Most of what they had waited and hoped for hadn't yet been realized. There was still trouble and oppression. There was still sin and treachery and death, and there was no escaping death. During the meal, Jesus took all of the old and well-known meanings of the big story and personalized them in himself. The bread was now his very body, which would be given for them. The cup, his very lifeblood, God's promise to them. The old story was about him, and it was about to come to fulfillment. And after that, a new story would begin. So it was night when they led him off to an illegal trial, a farce really, certainly an injustice, which would lead then to his crucifixion the next morning on the Friday. Because before the light of life that would dawn on the Sunday, evil would exhaust itself. And we can ask, could he have fought his way out of all of this? He was mostly silent through it all. He must have believed something would happen because of it. He must have believed that his own life deeply mattered for the life of the world. You know, when Jesus first burst onto the scene a mere 3 years previous, the one thing people noticed was his unmistakable authority. Such authority. Authority to heal the sick. Authority to still a storm. And even the authority to raise someone who had died from the dead. It was this last miracle that caused the authorities to hurry up their plan to get rid of him. We can't go on like this, they said. The whole world will believe in him if we let him carry on. There had always been something different about Jesus. When he fed the thousands in that out-of-the-way place, multiplying a boy's lunch, well, of course, everyone was awestruck. Who is this, they asked. And that was and is the question. Who is Jesus? We know they wanted to make him king right then and there, but he slipped away as he often did. But still, he was the king. He spoke often about a kingdom that was now dawning in their time, the kingdom of God, where all would be made right, all sins forgiven, all losses restored, all the loose ends of history and all the long-awaited storylines would now, in him, find their rest. I'm inviting you to take some time in these next few days to read the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. John's Gospel, chapters 18 to 20 would be a good place to do this. And let me suggest to you then that the cross and resurrection of Jesus is a real story and is meant to be experienced as such. And what it does is ground us in 3 successive realities. First, the reality of Friday. On Friday, we are confronted with the crucifixion, of course, the real human experience of loss and grief and pain and despair. Nothing of the dark side of human storied life is left out. Another way to say this maybe is that whatever we throw at God, whether we accuse him of forgetting us or whether we throw up our hands at the absurdity of it all, as Camus did, on the Friday, Jesus tackles all of the darkest parts of storied life that we can dredge up. Injustice? Yes, of course, he absorbs the pain of all that shouldn't be. Failure and sin, yes. Remember that Jesus' own friends fail him here, and how much of our storied lives is about living with the results of our own failures. From the cross, Jesus forgives. Broken expectations, yes. If there's anything I've learned about storied life, it's how so much doesn't happen in the way I think it should. The cross is God's answer to all of life's broken expectations. But there is order here too, if we can notice it, because John did. As John watches the scene of the cross, he notices that things are not out of control. Even as Jesus dies, his clothes are handled according to what the scriptures long ago foretold. And his bones aren't broken as the bones of the others are. He is the Lamb without blemish and will remain that way. So God sets boundaries on the evils that inflict Jesus. God is still in control. In the darkness of Friday, the world is always God's world. And then Saturday. We're not allowed to move too fast in this story, one day at a time. We now enter Saturday, the Sabbath day, the day of rest. We enter now this strange and silent waiting. I have often reflected on this part of the Easter story. Not much is said about it in the Gospels, just that the community observed the Sabbath and everything goes still. All they did was nothing but wait. Is the story over? Has it crashed and burned? Were the critics right? Did Camus and Kandera have a point? Well, we don't exactly know yet, do we? But I think we are shown that waiting for what only God can do does have its rewards. In those seasons or moments of life when things seem stalled or when the promise of life seems to linger too long, wait. I would invite you to remember the power of Holy Saturday. And then Sunday. The resurrection of Jesus is the event that changes the world. After the unbearable loss of Friday and the long wait of Saturday comes the great resolution of Sunday. So consider then that the resurrection of Jesus is the interpretive key for the whole of human storied life. Not in a cheap or easy way, because resurrection comes through relinquishment of life, through passages of despair, through the long wait. But all of that finally breaks into the new beginning. And now the author of life makes all things new. What I particularly love is that this new story doesn't throw away all the pieces of the old story. In fact, the new story is built out of every loose thread, every unrealized hope, every question in search of truth, every longing of what is good. The story of Friday, Saturday, is how the old story moves into the new story of Sunday. So where are you in this story? Where are we? In one sense, we continue to experience Friday. It's still with us. In another sense, we live in Saturday in the long wait for change. But there are those times, those moments of wonder when we realize that the new story has already begun. Do you have any resurrection stories? Well, let's take a bit of time to ask a few relevant questions. It's always worth saying that aside from any questions I might pose to you, there may be a few moments in this session that stand out for you. moments that you want to reflect on more, an insight perhaps that came to you, or a remembrance of something you had forgotten. Or maybe there's just something you need to voice. I would invite you to do that. But here are a few worthy lines of investigation. First, how do you respond to people like Camus and Kandera? In other words, critics of the life of faith. I have to admit, I often find real value in listening to those who want to ask the deeper questions of life, even if those questions emerge from outside of the story of God. Are there any writers or voices like this that appeal to you? I guess my general question here is about the kinds of voices that ask questions of life. Who are they for you? And then secondly, what aspects of Jesus' death and resurrection story have particularly meaning for you personally? And of course, familiarity with this story helps. So maybe I could ask it this way. Do you find it hard or easy to engage the story of Jesus and his cross? Are you drawn to it or repelled by it? Why do you think that might be? And third, I'm wondering if you have any specific questions or issues concerning the storied life that trouble you. You know, Dostoevsky was a person of faith, but he put into the words of his character, Ivan Karamazov, his greatest troubling thought, and that was of the suffering of children. So, do you have such troubling objections to faith? And if you do, are you able to see how they might be answered somehow in the story of Jesus' death and resurrection in some way? Why or why not? And finally, perhaps we might consider how the meaning of Jesus' life comes to us in a story, rather merely in a set of principled rules or observations. And of course, Jesus gives us observations in life, principles. But I think it's fair to say that the primary revelation of Jesus is his own storied life, especially the ultimate vindication of his life through the cross. So let me ask you, what do you think the significance of this is? One last thought. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who I've mentioned repeatedly through this series, were fellow professors at Oxford University in the middle of the last century, and they became very close friends. When they met, Tolkien was a man of deep Christian faith, whereas Lewis at that time could only give some sort of reluctant nod toward God. He hadn't yet become a believer in Jesus. He hadn't yet embraced the story of the dying and rising Jesus, the story that changes everything. Not yet. But then came this famous night of conversation. Lewis and Tolkien and their friend Hugo Dyson met for dinner, talking late into the night, as friends do. They talked about the great stories of literature and myth. They talked about the great themes these stories explored. And at a certain point, they stepped outside for a midnight stroll, walking along what was known in Oxford as Addison's Walk. I have been there. Recalling it later, Lewis said that a noticeable and almost mystical breeze whistled through the trees as they talked in that early morning hour. He said to his friends that he loved the myths with their themes of dying and rising, and how those stories deeply spoke to him of this quality of forever. But he said with tremendous regret, the myths are only stories, they're not true. And Tolkien, understanding all the subtle nuances of what they were talking about, shot back. He said, "Of course you know there is such a thing as true myth, where all of the themes of the old stories of life and death and of love and redemption and forever, where all of that actually becomes true in history. True myth." Later, Lewis wrote, that's the night with the wind in the trees, that something changed for him. He wrote his friend Arthur Greeves, "Now the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference that it really happened. True myth. For a story to change the world, it has to take up all the great questions, all of the loose threads of human existence and experience, and show how they can be transformed. Or as the Christmas carol says, the hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. For a story to change the world, it can't just appeal to the great themes. It has to have actually happened. I will see you next time for our final session.